I hate you, Carter. Stop. You're not even doing anything.
Should have bloopers.
God damn it, I was just about to talk. That's where we start the episode. It's right there.
That's great.
Welcome to Our Professor Podcast. I'm Micah Sander.
I'm Carter Green.
In our latest episode, we spoke with Professor Karen Stern.
It was taking everything in me not to start laughing.
Server mute her.
This intro's going to take forever. Okay.
Do they all take this long?
No.
Yes. Yes.
No, we're usually
It's
further
just me.
through this. Oh boy. Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm just
Usually.
so fun to talk with.
I just think we should just start off from the beginning. Welcome to Our Professor Podcast. I'm Micah Sander.
I'm Carter Green.
And in our latest episode of Our Professor Podcast, we spoke with Professor Karen Stern. Professor Karen Stern is an award-winning author who draws from fields of archaeology, anthropology, history, and religion to research the daily lives and material cultures of Jews of the ancient Mediterranean, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. She earned an A.B. in Classics at Dartmouth College, Ph.D. in Religious Studies at Brown University, and has conducted field research in Greece, the Middle East, and North Africa with grants, fellowships, and residencies from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Council of American Overseas Research Centers, and the Getty Villa. She is the author of Inscribing Devotion and Death, Archaeological Evidence for Jewish Populations of North Africa, Writing on the Wall, Graffiti and the Forgotten Jews of Antiquity, which won a 2020 Schnitzer Book Award, and co-editor of With the Loyal You Show Yourself Loyal, Essays on Relationships in the Hebrew Bible in Honor of Saul M. Olyan. The Daily Beast, Atlas Obscura, NPR, and The Guardian have all featured her work, and her current book project considers Jewish history through the senses. It's an extremely impressive bio. To speak about Professor Stern, we have here the Vice President of the Brooklyn College Historical Society, Rivka. Rivka, thank you for being on with us today.
Thank you, Micah.
Now, what has been your experience with Professor Stern?
The first history class I ever had was with Professor Stern, Shaping of the Modern World, and then also after that, Ancient Jewish History. One of my favorite things about that class was the way she incorporated textual sources and archaeological sources and looked at the way these two things informed each other and what we can tell about the experiences of ordinary people that maybe wasn't shown in the textual sources. And that also really informed the research that I worked on with her last semester as part of the Tau Mentorship and Research Program. You mentioned that she wrote a book on ancient Jewish graffiti. So this research was kind of taking from that and expanding it to look at other periods in history and try and create a narrative of change over time. But looking at how graffiti exists as a source, like an unofficial source outside of like these dominant textual discourses. Working with her, like, when I was taking a class with her, that was over Zoom. So I didn't actually meet her in person until, well, no, actually, that's not right. I took Shaping of the Modern World with her in person. And then I took Ancient Jewish History with her on Zoom. But I didn't actually like work with her closely in person until last fall. She was always very, understanding of my schedule, trying to work with me and like make sure that I was getting as much as possible out of the experience, even though it's not really a topic that I was super comfortable with because I generally focus more on modern history. But it was a really great experience overall. She's an amazing scholar and just like a really wonderful person. What else should I say? Give me another prompt.
I was going to ask, for people that have not taken multiple classes with her, what can they expect going in when they sign up for a class? The workload, the type of things they'll be learning, how the material is presented and everything. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Honestly, I haven't taken a class, like an actual class with her in a few years, so it's a little, the details of the class are a little fuzzy. There wasn't like any final, like long final paper. There was, the class I took with her was over Zoom, so I don't know how different it would be in person. But we had a final exam and a midterm, like online open book, and a few short writing assignments. I remember the reading load being pretty reasonable, and all the readings were really interesting. Yeah, not that much writing compared to like some other classes.
A lot of engagement between her and the material and the students.
Yeah. She also taught a colloquium last semester that I was sitting in on sometimes, but that's also different from like a lower level class. So, but she is teaching ancient Jewish history again in the fall, and I wish I could take it again, but I would recommend that class. If you're interested in Jewish history, it was a really great class.
Well, thank you, Rivka. That's a fantastic review of Professor Stern. I think we should get right to it then. Please give a gigantic Our Professor podcast welcome to Professor Karen Stern. Molto bene.
All right.
Okay, thank you, Professor Stern, for being on Our Professor podcast. Our first question for you is, why did you choose this area of study? Did it change over time? And was there a particularly important professor or mentor at any stage of your education?
Well, I'm not even sure if I could reasonably define what my area of study would be exactly, because there are lots of ways in which it sort of interfaces between the modern and ancient worlds. But the course of my study was entirely shaped by teachers of mine and experiences of mine. So I had a phenomenal Latin teacher in seventh grade, and she was bananas, and she could get kids excited about Latin like nobody's business. Actually, before then, in second grade, I had a teacher in my reading group who introduced us to a unit. There was a unit on Greek myths, and he brought us to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. There were only 3 kids in my reading group. That was sort of like it for me, even before the Latin, I would say, even before 7th grade. So if you were to sort of trace my trajectory of what I started doing, I mean, it's sort of like beads on a string of like phenomenal teachers. My second grade teacher is Mr. Roach. My 7th grade teacher is Miss Goodman. So I could sort of trace it that way. I had a great Greek history teacher, Greek and Roman history teacher in high school. And I also in high school worked on an excavation for the very first time when I was 16 years old, a site called Sepphoris in Israel. And I wasn't one of the people uncovering mosaics, but there a few trenches over, there were people who were excavating the sort of the pavements of the city. And there was a Greek inscription in it. Nobody could read it. And I said, the next time I come back to Sepphoris, I'm going to read this inscription. And then I studied classics when I was in college. I studied Greek and Latin in college. I had phenomenal professors. Through complete accidents, ended up doing my Ph.D. in religious studies instead of classics. That would be another super long, boring story. But really, it's sort of pivotal people and experiences that have just gotten me really excited about studying the ancient world. Enthusiasm is infectious. I think you could probably teach a phenomenal course on cardboard if you're the right person to do it. But luckily for me, there were professors of Greek and Latin and archaeology and biblical Hebrew and Aramaic, and those were sort of my guideposts that brought me on this sweeping journey around antiquity, mostly to North Africa and the Levant. But sort of a long answer, but that's what I would say. It's all the people, the places.
That's kind of similar to my experience. I think that the people really make history. For your book, Writing on the Walls, Graffiti and the Jews of Antiquity, you traveled to Jerusalem and to the Middle East to do on-site research. In addition, for other articles and just excursions, you've gone all over the Middle East, Jordan, Petra, and Israel, as you mentioned, and parts of Greece and all around. How has on-site research and being there enriched your connection with the content and helped you write your books and articles?
I couldn't have written any of them without being on site. What tends to happen is that the things that interest me most as these like kernels of information about the past often are things that other people have just not cared about. So they've discovered those things, but they don't care enough either to write extensively about them or to photograph them extensively. And even if they did, everybody's vantage is really different. So for me, I had to do that work. So I was really lucky that early on, I did a lot of field work in Greece and in Israel and in Jordan, because it just changes how you think about objects. You don't look at them as surfaces in the same way, because you have a sense of stratigraphy and a sense of the faults that can sort of underlie excavation reports and things. And it allows you to think a little bit more critically about it. When I was in North Africa, I couldn't have written that book without spending extensive amounts of time there, because there are some objects that have been published, but a lot of sites that might be published but badly photographed, or they're described but not depicted in some way. And so I really had to I wasn't excavating while I was there, but I really had to sort of muck around in museums in Carthage and Sfax, go to Morocco and do things like that to re-examine things, because again, everybody's eyes are different, and people might publish an object and they might say, oh, this inscription is like such and such, but they don't record that there's a picture that's also drawn on the inscription, or that this was found in one place versus another place. So you really need to use your own eyes to do it. And the same was definitely true with the graffiti, because people they might describe things, but in excavation reports, a lot of people traditionally dismiss these things. And so I had to sort of go and see exactly where they were, from what angle were they carved, and what else is around one little graffito, what surrounds it. Are there other ones? Were people actually writing in dialogue with each other? These are the types of things, sort of the interactive pieces, that really require being in the field. So it's actually very hard for me to write about anything when I'm not directly sort of in situ myself beforehand, because I'm just aware of all of those limitations. So it's sort of a ping pong between seeing things, writing about them, thinking about them.
If I could add on a question about the research you were doing on graffiti, and I remember the presentation Rivka gave, and has your approach to seeing graffiti just in the world today changed with your research looking at it in the ancient world?
I've always had sort of like a general appreciation for it, but I think there's sort of like two streams of views of graffiti and street art today. One would be to sort of really admire certain artists who do great work locally, nationally, internationally, like teams or individuals who do that work. And so there is sort of a stream now where people really appreciate street art and the aesthetics of street art. Traditionally, it was not necessarily the case, or it was often viewed as sort of reflections of different types of vandalism and that sort of thing. And that can still be true, right? We can have mean graffiti, we can have violent graffiti. But at the same time, I look at it now very differently, as a way that people can sort of take ownership of spaces that don't belong to them, in positive as well as negative ways. They appropriate them, right? So they can advocate positions that are positive as well as negative. They might not own a building, but by sort of taking over a surface of the building, they're sort of using it for their own purposes. So it's sort of, in a weird way, it's sort of economically democratizing. There are ways that covering a surface with a particular image or message can be much more powerful than the architecture of the building itself. It makes me think about different ways small acts can really change the world around us, from a visual perspective or textual perspective. That might sound really abstract, but for sure, that's true. There's a great museum in Berlin. I don't know if you were able to see it, the Urban Nation Museum, that has a lot of wonderful examples of these sorts of things.
We'll have to catch that one on the next time.
Yeah, sure.
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Christianity, like most religions, has made a concerted effort over its existence to write its own accounts of its history. This has made it to where the further back you go into Christian history, the more mythologized it gets. This being the case, how do you go about sifting through the mountains of work that are secondary sources but claim to be firsthand sources? Pretty much, how do you get as close as possible to a true primary source for things that are so ancient?
Well, I have to say this sort of reflects my bias in preferring archaeological materials, not exclusively, but there are ways in which we know that texts are composed by elites, right? As such, they offer a very, very particular perspective on the world, right? So if somebody in antiquity had the ability to read or write, they have a certain amount of training, a certain vantage, and probably a certain, economic status at the same time. And that's why I think it's so important to pay attention to the little stuff whenever we have it available. Graffiti are great in that regard, because they're sort of small signs of the ways that other people thought about the same types of ideas or how they express them, right? So we can read the texts of Augustine, we can read the texts of Tertullian, but in many ways, when you look at where graffiti is distributed in different parts of the ancient world, in North Africa for sure, how people were clustering their graves in different shrines, where people wanted to be physically closest to what epitaphs say, what graffiti say. I think considering the widest possible range of sources is the way to best address that. So you can say, okay, these are texts from this particular time that describe what people should believe or what people should do, but what, at least archaeologically, do we see that people are actually doing? That's a totally different picture sometimes. So my vote is look to the archaeological record. It's really tough with Christianity, particularly because we have the record of the earliest Christian building in Syria in the 3rd century. And from earlier periods, we definitely don't have as much. So it really comes from later periods that we have that ability, but still it's worthwhile doing. It's a pivotal 2 centuries or something like that, but it's still good to sort of dig around. And people are doing really interesting work. I know somebody who is at Yale, and she's looking at the illumination of spaces and how that reflects theology and belief and things like that. Really interesting work being done. So my vote would be just look to as many different types of sources as possible and allow those sources to help guide new readings of those texts instead of necessarily the other way around.
It kind of makes me curious that you spent quite a lot of time on these ancient archaeology sites. In your own opinion, has humanity come a long way, or are we still the same type of people? We still value the same things. We still make the same kind of jokes. There's the famous graffiti in Pompeii where it's like your mom joke written on the wall that got preserved. What's one of the funnier or one of the more lighthearted things you found in your archaeology?
Ooh, that's a tough question. The first part of your question, sort of thinking about how humans have changed, in many ways they haven't. I think we like to think of ourselves as being very sophisticated and modern and smart, but when push comes to shove, a lot of our life experiences are a little bit similar to those of people in the ancient world. They had families too. They just might have been more extended families. They had friends, they had parents, they had children, they had grandparents. Certain realities of being more, more susceptible to sort of immediate tragedies. Typically, at least in the United States, a lot of people who have had economic agency have not felt like, oh, anything could come at any time and just change our way of life or destroy things. I think in that way, the pandemic was a real equivocator. Chronologically, it sort of reminded us that in many ways we have the same needs that people did in antiquity, and sometimes we can get blindsided and technology can't even help us either, right? So the biggest difference is that we do have things like technology. We do have computers and devices that change our brains and the way we think and the degree to which we can be connected to people from very far away. So I feel like it's the forces of the global forces, the ability to connect to people far away, but also to be exposed to ideas that are sort of outside people's immediate environments. That's really changed. But I think part of what's comforting about studying the ancient world is that it sort of reminds us that in certain ways people had many more challenges than we do, but there are other things that they sort of got right that we don't necessarily. So we can learn from that too, even if everything wasn't necessarily so rosy. As you mentioned, like in terms of funny things, I feel like my work isn't as funny as I would like it to be. People who work, strictly speaking, on Rome and Greece, I feel like they get more body jokes in their graffiti. They get more sort of nastiness in the political slogans that they find on walls. So I'm a little bit jealous of that sometimes. But I will say that, when you look at writings that people set on walls, there's like a graffito. I just saw it again when I was at the Beit Sha'arim catacombs about a week ago. And there's this message on the wall. It says, "Good luck on your resurrection." And you could first read that and you could say, "Oh, that's nice." Like they're really wishing people good luck because they anticipate that everybody who's brought into the catacombs is going to be resurrected in the world to come. And they're offering them good luck. But then you can sit back and say, like, is that a little sarcastic? Like, hey, good luck on that journey, wink, wink, So I think a lot of it is vantage, it's sort of how we see it. So I generally in the materials that I work on more closely, I don't get the nasty fun comments in ways that people might get elsewhere, but maybe I can read into it enough to get some sense of personality out of people who wrote things and drew things. And I try.
I took a colloquium with you, the history of religion through the senses, and you have a bunch of very clever and interactive ways to get people to understand the material and engage them in the learning process. Examples include on-site smell scavenger hunt, incense sampling, bread baking. Just how has this helped you teach your subjects, and how did you come up with these?
The full disclosure, the smell scavenger hunt was an immediate invention in that very moment. How do I come up with these things? Well, it relates, no class you teach is ever the same, right? You could teach the same class a million times and the students make it different every time. And the room makes it different every time if you're teaching in a room. So also does like the cultural zeitgeist. What it takes to make a classroom an effective place right now is very different than what it took 10 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. It used to be that you expected to go into a class, sometimes even seminars, and the professor would drone on and on about some subject. That's not how people learn anymore. That's not how I learn. I believe that if you go back to Plato, right? Education is dialogical, but I don't necessarily think it's just a dialogue between people. It's a dialogue between people and smells and people and museums and grass. And I think we can learn a lot from the environment around us. And so a lot of those methods were a response to a rapid change in how a lot of students learned, particularly during the pandemic. I would take students to the museum before the pandemic, like in the before times, and that was great. But people require just more to be engaged now. And I think that it actually helps the learning process. So it doesn't detract from it at all. So that's why I try to look to ways to sort of get us to think differently about smell and its relationship to life experience or religious experience, or how does the task of trying to bake bread in a Pompeian way allow us to appreciate how very differently the tools were that people used to use to create what sustained them. So I can just rant on and on about it, but that's not going to bring it home. You know, it really requires your nose or my failed bread experiment, right? To remind you and me of these features that really change how we think about the past, right? Whether we're talking about something in 1850 or we're talking about something in 1000 BCE, it helps us appreciate and get information from the world differently. And so those exercises are all designed to do it. And it's very much responsive to each and every class. So it depends on the personality of people in the class. Sometimes students just want people to talk. Usually they don't. Sometimes people want to go visit, museums or see objects. And sometimes students just need more to draw them in. And like a quiet classroom is not a happy classroom. And so all of these are sort of pedagogical tools toward the effort of just sort of exciting us to think differently about readings that might be doing or ways that we look at past events and that sort of thing. Again, maybe that's pretty abstract, but right now I view it as being absolutely critical to people's ability to learn in an effective way. So that's why I do it. And it's more fun. Smelling target can be very important when you're reading a neuroscience article about an olfaction. It all brings it home. So
it was definitely probably the most fun college class I've had. So it worked.
That's amazing. Yay. And it's on record. So great.
Carter, I believe you burned your Pompeian bread, right?
I did. I left it in the oven for an hour too long.
Yeah, it's really a tough assignment. And that class particularly, and I told your class this, I invented the class on the history of religion through the senses, specifically in response to the pandemic, because the first time I taught it, the class was on Zoom. And I was so tired of just having students look at me on a screen and my looking at them. And typically I teach a course on visual history, but I mean, we were doing a lot of looking. And so I felt like to exploit people's home environments was a better way, take advantage of the fact that if we burned incense, the fire alarms wouldn't go off, all of these things. So that's how that was designed, but it had to be retooled for an actual in vivo school environment. But it still, I think, speaks to a need that people have now, which is we have to take advantage that we're in school, in a classroom, in a college together, right? There is an advantage to learning as a process, as a group, in human. There's a complete difference from that sort of setting and then having an all online environment. And I think if Zoom teaching during the pandemic taught me anything, it's of even more sort of the consummate value of in-person education, and doing those types of activities really exploits that and takes advantage of that and demonstrates why it can be so useful for learning and sort of group togetherness, but it helps you sort of access the material in new ways.
I've always had a lot of fun whenever I got to visit I remember sort of those final presentations, I got to visit your class, and it was fun.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me as a guest. But also you've brought up in talks previously that through many of your conferences and international talks that you've gotten to meet a lot of your academic heroes and even become peers with them, which must feel a little surreal. How did it feel going from reading these academics' works and using them as research to then go on and help them with their research to further the field that you're so invested in?
It's strange, right? It's an odd thing. I guess the process is different than sort of other types of fields, I guess, partly because there are certain scholars that people generally hold in esteem, right? And you might not necessarily see them. We can all like learn online what people look like, but it's very different to sort of encounter them and have meaningful conversations with them. And I think what it speaks to is just every person's vantage is different, right? You could meet with specialists in Roman Egypt or Roman and Byzantine Palestine, and they know sources like nobody's business, but they've just never thought about certain things, right? They just haven't raised certain questions. So I think it's contributing something new and different that tweaks an ongoing scholarly conversation, which feels really meaningful. And it sort of depends on the personalities of people involved, of course, how they feel about it. But it's been great. It's been great. I think that I was reminded after not going to conferences for so many years and going back to academic conferences, that there really is a common way of looking at the world, and you sort of see your people and talk to them, and it feels so good that so much of this is really about, I mean, it sounds really abstract and sort of cheesy. It's like people who are really interested in the same thing, and it's part of this ongoing conversation. And when you study, I don't know, the 5th century, it's like you're living in the same space of like engaging in the present, but thinking about the past. So it's nice to join that group for sure. It can be a really powerful thing, but it's really exciting. And I think that for those of you who are in the historical society, it's probably the same sort of dynamic, because a lot of the time you might just be hanging out, but you're also really interested in East Berlin in 1970 or something. You know what I mean? And it's sort of ultimately like that, but you ultimately sort of write in a way that you're extending the intellectual piece of that conversation sort of in an ongoing way. It's fun. Like that part of it is really a lot of fun, and I enjoy it.
Do you have any current projects of note that you'd like to tell us about? Any books coming out, articles, some new classes that you've been thinking about offering in the next semesters?
Well, right now, I told you I'm working on this paper for this upcoming conference, and it's about illumination and smell and touch in catacombs. And I was able to teach my family firsthand of the wonders of crawling through catacombs a few days ago. So it's reminded of the potency of all of those features, because it's really good to see and not smell bad things in catacombs. But I'm working on a project now on sort of a history of Judaism through the census, of early Judaism through the census. And that's part of what I've been writing up this semester. I think I'll probably continue to teach related classes. I might also, something I would love to do, and I've tried to figure out the logistics of this often, is return to having classes that are sort of half at the college, half at the Brooklyn Museum, and try to teach an object history course in that way, so students can write their own object histories based on their work in the museum. So I think that would be a lot of fun. I might teach my religion and violence class again, but that's usually I feel like we need the world to stabilize a little bit more before I can return to that subject. But again, I think I want to increasingly get students back into the field, whatever that means. Now, if I could do a foreign study program or teach a course entirely in the field, that would be ideal. But the second tier to that is just to spend a lot more time in museums, having students actually pick up objects and feel them and examine them and incorporate that into their research. The extreme rapid rise of ChatGPT has taught us anything. It's that the in-person, the tactile, and the interactive is more important than ever. And so I want to gear my classes ahead to in that sort of direction, if that makes sense. You know, there's so much we can outsource, but it's not about memorizing information, because that's what we can use ChatGPT for. That's what we can Google, right? It's about how we think about the world. It's about how we learn. And again, for me, it's about like crawling through the catacombs. It's about picking up the little perfume jar. It's going into the archives of museums and having access to things that few people have touched since they were brought from the ground. Those are the types of experiences that are really meaningful to me in my own research, and I think can be really fun for students too, to sort of actualize, like, why am I in college? Why am I learning about this? What are the skills that are important to me as a human, not as a robot? So those are the types of things that I hope to do more of in the near future.
That's very exciting, especially for me who's enjoyed your classes. So I'm looking forward to it. The final segment is the Fast Five questions, where it's very no thinky, first thing that pops into your brain, just casual questions to end it off on. Do you have a favorite book?
Yes. Well, when I want to go on a mental vacation, my favorite book is Moving the Palace by Sharif Majdalani. I hope I pronounced his name correctly, but it's just like a dream. It's wonderful.
Do you have a favorite food?
In winter, it's Cuba soup.
Your favorite non-work activity?
Running, spending time with my family, traveling, and not looking at old things. Because then it's work, even though it's fun.
Your favorite thing to do in New York City?
I like finding teeny tiny bookstores that still exist, and like teeny tiny secret gardens in different places. I wouldn't name the one on the Upper West Side because it would make it less secret. but you know, they're sprinkled throughout the city, but just like finding these little gems of green or books. Those are my favorite things. Yeah.
And the final question, what is your favorite genre of music?
Yeah, see, that's a really tough one. Depending on my mood, I would say I really look back, because I'm an old person, to like, I wasn't even like fully alive for this, I will note, but like 70s New York punk is like my happy place. So it's sort of like, it's angry, but it makes me so happy.
Sick. I love that.
That's awesome. That's a different answer from every professor now, isn't it? For
Really?
music genre. Yeah.
I have to look at the list. You have to post a list. Like, you can just map our psyches according to our.
I believe that's all the questions we've got for you today. Professor Stern, thank you so much. This was so much fun. Thank you for coming on our podcast.
Okay, you're welcome. It was great to see both of you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. And hope to talk to you soon.
Great. Bye-bye.
Our Professor podcast was recorded with the permission of the Brooklyn College History Department and our student interviewees. We would like to thank both the students and the faculty for their contributions.